Worship leader, here are 5 signs that you might love music more than you love worship. The first sign, do you find yourself thinking about gear more than you find yourself thinking about God? Then you might love music more than you love worship. Now, I'm obviously not saying that gear isn't important and not something that we need to be mindful of, but obviously we need to have our priorities straight. If we have the best guitar tone in the world, if we know how to play our instrument the best that we possibly can, but if we have not a proper understanding of God and a love for Him, all of it doesn't matter. You can play your guitar as good as you possibly can. You can have all of the Helix patches in the world dialed in. You can have Ableton set up to trigger every automation you can imagine, advancing the next slide, hitting the next lighting cue, making you your cup of coffee in the morning. Wouldn't that be cool? I want to see a video on that. Somebody, Jake from Churchfront, or Ryland Russell, make me a video where I can set up an Ableton cue to trigger my coffee machine. I'm sure you can do that. I love those guys, by the way. I'm not trying to come down hard on tech channels. I'm friends with a lot of worship tech YouTubers. But, and they would say this too, they would agree with me, I guarantee 100%, that worship leaders all too often are way more interested in tech than they are in theology of worship or thinking about God. And this is evidenced by, I'm friends with a lot of worship leading YouTubers, not that there are a ton of them, but all the ones that I'm friends with lament that if we make YouTube videos about budget in-ears, we will get 1 million views every single time. But if we talk about the theology of worship, we will get 100 views. It's just the fact of life. But if you're watching this video, I'm saying that if you are in that camp, that might be a sign that you love music more than you love worship. The second sign that you might love music more than you love worship is that when you're planning your worship services, you only think about music. You never consider any other elements of worship in your service because ultimately, let's be generous here. Number one, maybe you don't know that there are other elements that we should be including in our worship services. But number two, maybe you would rather have music than doing the things that God has commanded us in His Word to focus on when we gather together. Those things, namely being singing, yes. Number two, preaching. We usually have that one as well. What about intentional times of prayer, though? Not transitionary prayers, but intentional times of praying prayers of adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. What about communion in there? What about scripture reading? How often would we be like, I can't read 15 verses of scripture because people will tune out, but I am going to sing this spontaneous worship song that is 15 minutes long. Might be a sign that you love music more than you love worship. Oh, and then we've got baptism and communion as well. I feel like I messed those numbers up. For clarity, we have singing, we have preaching, we have praying, we have scripture reading, public reading of scripture. We have baptism and communion. These are the elements of worship that God has given us to incorporate and to use to glorify Him in our worship services. So let's use them and stop just focusing on one if we are in charge of planning the entire service. The third sign that you might love music more than you love worship is that you prioritize artistry over the purpose of corporate worship. And I don't necessarily want to make those two sound like they are at odds with each other, because we should be artistic in the way that we do things. By that I mean serving God with the gifts that we have with excellence. One of those gifts is artistry. So don't hear me wrong on this. I'm not saying that we aren't creative at all and we just dumb things down as much as we can, but we must never let artistry trump the purpose of our corporate gatherings. I'll give you a few examples here. One of those would be, let's think back to the elements of worship. How would artistry trump some of those elements of worship? Here's one way. Maybe God has commanded us in His Word, this isn't a maybe, this is a fact, God has commanded us in His Word to read Scripture in our public gatherings, but a way that artistry would trump that would be to say, well, I'm not going to read Scripture in our services because we don't have time for that, and it's kind of boring because people won't be able to pay attention for 10 verses. So instead of that, what if we do a spoken word instead? And now we've removed something that God has commanded in His Word for us to do when we gather together, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture. These were Paul's words to Timothy. We've removed that and said, that's not good enough for me. I want to be artistic, so let me put some spoken word in there. And we get rid of Scripture, and we just put that in there and say this kind of fulfills the same purpose, but it doesn't because it wasn't commanded by God. That's prioritizing artistry over the purpose of our corporate gatherings, which God has given us. We don't get to make it up on our own. So that's one example. Another example, let's get like super practical here, could be my voice sounds really good in this key because I can sing really high, but the people in my church, they can't sing that high. And so I'm going to choose my artistry, being able to sound the best that I can possibly sound, over everybody being able to sing together, when Colossians 3:16 tells us to do what? Address one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. It is a one anothering, not just of you to the people you're singing to. This is why I don't prefer special music. But the one anothering is something that is done from person to person as we sing together. It is a collective one anothering as we teach and admonish one another through the songs that we sing. And so if that's the purpose of our corporate gatherings, then we don't want to place our artistry above that and say, well, I just want to sound really good this morning. And it doesn't really matter if the people sing or not because I'm going to sound good. I know I'm taking this to an extreme, and you could massage that any way you want and try to make it work in your head. I'm just saying, don't put artistry over the purpose of our corporate gatherings. The fourth sign that you might love music more than you love worship is that you care about having a full band more than you care about the people on your worship team being believers. When our worship team leads worship with us, which, by the way, I believe that they are helping lead worship in that moment, only believers can lead worship. Only believers can participate in acts of worship, because unbelievers cannot come to the Father because they aren't coming through Jesus Christ. In fact, if they did come to the Father, it would not be good for them because they would be met with the holy justice of God and experience wrath for their sin, which, by the way, should point us to the gospel, that the same would be true for us if we didn't come through Jesus Christ. That's why unbelievers can't worship, and unbelievers should not be leading worship in your church. So why might one of the reasons be that we would allow an unbeliever onto our team? It's because, hey, I really need a drummer this Sunday. I really need a guitarist this Sunday. If we just had an electric guitarist, it would really fill out the sound. And I know not everybody's making that argument. They're like, well, this is, a mission field sort of thing where we can use that to bring people into the church. I would argue against that, but that's not the point of this video. I'm talking about, think about sincerely. Why is this person on my team? Did I just have them on the team because they knew how to play drums, and I feel like we can't worship if we don't have a drummer in our church? I'm guaranteeing you, you can worship if you do not have a drummer in your church. We can't prioritize having a full band over having proper expectations for our worship team. One of those proper expectations should be that the people on our worship team who are serving in the church, who are leading worship, should be believers. And one of the reasons we might circumnavigate that expectation is because we think, I really like music and I would like to have a full band sound today, and so let me just get this person who shouldn't really be on the worship team on here so I can have a full band over having proper expectations for my worship team members. The fifth sign that you might love music more than you love worship is that if you had your hands chopped off or your voice taken away, if you're a singer, you would feel like, I can't worship God anymore. You would be devastated and say, God, what am I going to do? My entire life I've worshiped you through playing an instrument and singing. Now what? And by the way, I'm speaking from experience here because I went through that a few months ago. Luckily, I've healed from that. But for 4 months, essentially, I could not sing at my church. And I shared those videos. I'll link them down in the description below. I shared those videos on this YouTube channel. And I'm so thankful that I had the perspective that I do not just worship God through singing. I'm more than my singing. I'm more than my guitar playing. Luckily, I didn't get my hands cut off, but someday I could have my hands cut off. What would I do? I would hope that I would still be able to write things like I wrote when I first lost my voice. Something like, if not with my singing, with my preaching. If not with my voice, with my pen. If not with my words, with my whole heart. If not with my life, with my death. If not on the earth, then in heavenly places forever will I glorify God. That should be the heart cry of every worship leader. God, no matter what way you have given me to worship you, whether it's with my singing, whether it's with my guitar playing, whatever it is, if you take those things away, that's not going to change the fact that I'm going to worship you, because I'm not in love with the means of worshiping you. I'm in love with you. I'm in love with the fact that I get to worship the God of the universe by the Spirit through the work of Jesus Christ. I come before the Father. That's what I'm in love with. And I get to do that in a million different ways in my life. as I serve God. It could be through singing. It could be through playing an instrument. It could be through writing. It could be through serving back at the sound booth. It could be through preaching. It could be through serving at my church food pantry. It could be through going on a mission trip. Whatever it is, I'm going to worship God with the spiritual service of my life, Romans 12:1. And I don't care if it's through music or some other means, because I just love to worship God. I don't just love music. Now, a caveat to everything that I just said. I want you to hear me again. I'm not saying that those things that I talked about are bad. We just need to have them in a right proportion. And one of the things that we need to have in a right proportion are the elements of worship in our service. Not just singing a set list of songs and saying, okay, I'm good, I worshiped God today, but incorporating those other elements of worship. One of the ways we do that is going to involve speaking between worship songs. That's a skill that we're going to need to learn as worship leaders. That's why I put together 5 worship speaking transitions you can use this Sunday. You'll find it linked down in the description below. If you want to start the process of leading your church in more than just singing, check that out down below. I'll walk you through the process of speaking between worship songs for the next 5 weeks. Other than that, until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.